Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Gender Pay Gap in Tech. My name is John Sudicum, and I'll be your moderator. I know that there's a lot going on right now, so I really want to thank you for carving out some of your time to discuss this important topic with us today. So we're going to do things a little different today, as I'm joined by two panelists. These are Masha Sfereva and Sabrina Baker. Masha is an entrepreneur, educator, ex-Googler, and founder of Coding Blonde, a blog dedicated to empowering women in technology and breaking stereotypes. Sabrina Baker is the founder of Acacia HR Solutions, a human resources consulting firm headquartered in Los Angeles. So about a month ago, we published data on the gender pay gap in tech to generate more conversation on the topic. And we're really happy that these two women are joining us today to help us further understand the data and add their perspective. We're going to reserve much of our time today to ask them questions. I'm going to start off with a few, and we would love for you to submit your own as well. Now, we have just a few housekeeping items to cover before we really get going. Our plan is to make this webinar as interactive as possible. We'll be accepting questions at the end of the webinar, so we'd love your participation. To do so, please use the question panel at the bottom of your player. And for those of you that have been to one of our webinars before, you should know that they're typically geared towards recruiting professionals. But today, because of the topic, we have tech professionals with us as well, which is really exciting. Next, today's webinar will be available on demand after the live session, and a link will be sent via email. We know that many of you are joining us from home, and Wi-Fi can be difficult during this time. So if anything happens, please know that you will get a recording. And last, there will be a post-webinar survey, and we would love your feedback. Okay, so today our plan is to begin by introducing DICE's research and report on the gender pay gap in tech, and bring everyone here up to speed on what we found in regard to salary differentials. Then we're going to shift to talk about the satisfaction differences between men and women in tech. And then we're going to speak with our panelists and get their perspective on the topic and what can be done. Before we get going, one last thing. I'd like to briefly introduce DICE. If you know DICE, or if you don't know DICE actually, we make tech hiring easier. We are tech specialists that cut your time to hire by connecting you with quality and actionable candidates. Okay, now let's jump into it. So despite recent pushes for gender pay equality, issues still persist in the tech industry. These pay gaps between men and women salaries exist even when other factors, including experience, roles, location, and education are controlled for. And while tech is leading the world in many regards, it has some work to do in this particular area. So to help raise awareness and drive the discussion about salary equality, DICE published its findings on pay differences between men and women in the technology field, and we put real numbers behind compensation inequality. We thought the data was shocking, but pretty important to publish, and if you haven't already seen this report, we encourage you to do so. Now, I briefly want to go over some of the nuances of the study because I think they're pretty important. First, we collected this data while running our annual salary survey between 2017 and 2019. And in addition, we conducted a panel to supplement our data in 2019. Our different data set controls for factors like location, years of experience, role, and education. So for example, our data compares the salary difference between men and women in a cloud engineer role if they have the same years of experience, education, and we're in the same state. And when we compare state level differentials, we compare men and women as if they had the same role, education, and years of experience, but are based in the same state. Okay, now let's jump into some of the data. Here are some of the most significant pay differentials in the US. As you can see, nearly every US state and region shows a negative pay differential, meaning that women are paid less than men, and thus indicates that there is a gender pay gap. While some differentials are wider than others, the data represents an industry-wide issue related to unequal pay, transcending state lines and regions. One state worth calling out, however, is Minnesota, which showed a positive pay differential, meaning women are paid more. So we also gathered salary differential information for some of tech's most important roles. At this level, a wider range of pay disparity exists between both common roles and roles with growing momentum and business need. Historically, the gender pay gap has been attributed to the opportunity gap, meaning women's opportunity to hold higher level, higher paying jobs compared to men. While we definitely acknowledge its existence and that studies have been published over the years demonstrating the the opportunity gap's connection to gender, as I mentioned earlier, our data largely controls for this factor. Now, I'd like to make two quick callouts that I think are pretty interesting. First is software engineer. Businesses throughout the United States are hiring software engineers at a remarkable rate. And in fact, this role accounts for roughly 12% of all tech job postings listed in the past year. And it has a projected growth of about 30% over the next decade. Yet, despite the growth and demand, this occupation still shows a pay differential of more than $8,000 between men and women. Next is data engineer, which is certainly a job on the rise. Between 2018 and 2019, data engineering roles showed the most significant growth in job postings, with a 50% year-over-year increase. While this occupation is growing tremendously, data engineer roles show a pay differential of more than $9,000 between men and women. We also think it's important to note that occupations including cloud engineer, systems architect, network engineer, and technical writer all show a positive differential, meaning that women are paid more. While some of those differentials are too small to be statistically significant, they're definitely interesting. Okay, now let's shift gears and quickly talk about other factors beyond salary. In addition to salary differentials, in our study, we also analyzed the satisfaction levels related to compensation, job, team, and more. Overall, our data suggests that women are generally less satisfied than men in tech. For employers, that's an issue as unsatisfied employees tend to leave, which impacts a company's ability to retain its collective skills and knowledge, as well as attract new candidates with a less than ideal employer brand. When we look at the numbers, 51% of men said that they are satisfied with their compensation, while 49% of women said the same. And when we look at burnout, while 31% of men say they feel burnt out, 33% of women said the same. But let's look at some of the causes of burnout between men and women. Looking at these causes as a whole, we can see that the roots of burnout among men and women in tech are wide-ranging and certainly present. And there's causes like workload that are rising to the top of the list. But let's look at some of the causes that resonate with women more than men. When we do this, lack of recognition, friction with their boss, and friction with their team certainly stick out. Generally speaking, factors like satisfaction and burnout contribute to a professional's likelihood to change employers. And what we see here is consistent with our earlier data. That is, more women are looking to change employers within the next year than men. When it comes to the reasons for changing employers, the data between men and women was somewhat similar, but let's take a deeper look. The highest ranking reason that women ranked was higher compensation. Also worth considering is that nearly half of female respondents noted that better working conditions, and nearly a third noted gaining more responsibility as reasons for changing employers. It goes without saying that building a gender diverse workforce is a business necessity, but it also creates a more dynamic work culture and leads to more creative problem solving. So with this in mind, it's important to consider the benefits men and women consider important. While there are a few similarities, like health insurance and paid vacation, a few key differences also exist. For example, female respondents to our survey put more importance than men on benefits like remote work, wellness programs, maternity leave, and paid volunteer opportunities. So this is a quick way of going through the data that we gathered through our gender pay gap report. And as we can see here, there's certainly work to be done, though employers are certainly taking steps to improve. But today we're really thrilled to have Masha and Sabrina with us, who can help round out our understanding of the issue. So as I mentioned earlier, I have a few questions that I'd like to ask to begin with, and then we would love to have your questions as well. So I'm going to begin with Sabrina. So if two of you wouldn't mind unmuting yourselves, I'd like to ask you a question about, very high level, is do you think there is a gender pay gap?
Yeah, absolutely. I think obviously it's clear in the data, but anybody who working in this space, even with the data, knows that it does exist and it has existed for a number of years. I think as you showed, it's getting better in some places, but we still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I mean, the data is clear, and also from my personal experience working and building communities with people in technology on social media, there is a huge gap, and we need to do something about it. So I'm very happy that we're doing this today.
Thank you both. And Masha, when I first spoke with you a few weeks ago, you spoke a little bit about where this first came from. And would you mind kind of running our audience through that here now?
Absolutely. So I think that there is a historical component to the situation that we're facing right now. It basically, women used to be working in software back in 1940s, 1950s. Software used to be a female job as a rule, and while men were focusing much more on hardware. And as times went by, the profession was this field was professionalized and therefore masculinized. There was a PR campaign that kind of pushed out women. It positioned women as candidates that are not very fit, and that created conditions, hiring conditions that were unfair and that were favoring male candidates, and in particular, one type of male, the stereotype that we have right now, right? The antisocial person who doesn't sleep at night but just codes, and that created, back in the day, we had different discrimination rules, and what happened has happened. But I believe that that is the root cause for the situation that we have right now, because I think it created two things. It created a stereotype that the tech industry is masculine, and that predominantly people who work in it are male, and they are a certain type of male as well. And it also created stereotype in women's brains that they don't belong in the industry, that they're not the right type of candidate, which I feel that the stereotype inside of women's heads is almost more dangerous when it comes to this, because they have to overcome so much more. So yeah, and I think that was the root cause. There were some stereotypes that have been created, and since then, it's a combination of a psychological and a systemic problem that we are observing, with systemic being companies not wanting to pay their candidates more than they have to, right? And there's this question of what was your previous salary, that is still prevalent, unfortunately, in hiring processes, and also women. As a general rule, as a woman myself, I tend to not negotiate as much as I would like to, or as my equally qualified male colleagues would. So I think there are a bunch of variables that are at play here, and it means that we can do something about it, but that's the cause, initially, in my opinion, at least.
Thank you for that, Masha. So I'm going to move on to this next question here, which I think that you hit on a lot, Masha. And I'm also going to turn this over to Sabrina now. Sabrina, why do you think that the gender pay gap is persistent, or it happens in tech?
Yeah, I think Masha just explained it beautifully, and I agree with absolutely everything that she shared. I think it's been a long-standing issue for many, many years. Unfortunately, until maybe the past few years, did we really start talking about it. I mean, this, and in tech and across other industries as well, it's been present for so long, and especially in to her point about being stereotypically male. In any place where you have those kind of stereotypes, then you're going to have this pay gap. And if you're not paying attention to it, or nobody's talking about it, then it's just going to get larger and larger and larger. And so I think until recently, when we started noticing it, started paying more attention, or at least maybe not paying more attention, because I think we've been doing that, but really started talking about it vocally, the power of social media and reporting, like what DICE is doing, to really share the numbers, put some numbers to it. I think for many years, I can remember early in my career, we had anecdotal conversations, right? We would say that it exists, but nobody could really put some massive numbers to it. We knew what was happening in our own companies or in our own city, but we really didn't look at it on a nation or global scale. And so it was allowed, because of that, because of the lack of attention, it was allowed to get larger and larger and larger. And now that we see there's focus on it, we are bringing it down. And certainly in states where they have pay disparity laws, or they have banned the salary question. Unfortunately, it's not banned everywhere, but in places where it is, then you see it getting better. But I think it exists just because it took us so long to get vocal about it and have more eyes on it than just the women and men who are in the industry.
Thank you for that, Sabrina. And Masha, is there anything that you'd like to add to that question as well before we move on here?
Yeah, I completely agree with Sabrina. I think that putting real numbers and kind of demystifying the topic has helped a lot. But when it was a mystery, when it was kind of untouched, that aggravated the problem. So yeah, putting real numbers to it and really seeing what we can do about it and track it is going to definitely help.
Thank you for that, Masha. So I'd like to shift gears here and kind of talk about the hiring process itself. So what's great about having the both of you here is, Masha, you kind of represent more of the technologist side, as someone that's worked for Google. Then we also have Sabrina here, who is an HR consultant. So I'd like to ask, how do you think that the hiring process kind of contributes or is helping this issue? So why don't we begin with Sabrina here?
Sure. So I think coming from the HR side of it, so from the interviewer side, I don't believe, or at least never in my career, I know that this probably exists, but let me just say that never in my career have I had a hiring manager or CEO or a company say, I purposely want to pay women less. It's usually not intentional in any means. But the way that we structured the hiring process is that up until recently, we were able to ask, what's your salary history? And because we have historically been paid less, then their salary history is lower. To Mash's point earlier, women tend to negotiate a little bit less. They tend to, I think, devalue their worth sometimes. And so they ask for less, or they're willing to take less because maybe they have a partner who is paying and they don't really need as much money. So they think, oh, they'll take less. And so the hiring process is really kind of structured to obviously get candidates at the best price for the company, right? We're trying to keep within a budget, we're trying to keep within numbers. And so as we ask questions around salary history, typically companies want to give the lowest salary they possibly can and still get the highest level of output. And so it's not a intentional thing where we just say, oh, here's the salary structure for men and here it is for women. It just so happens that the way we ask questions, the way we the way we encourage women or discourage them really to negotiate or really value their worth, they tend to ask for less. And so if they're going to ask for less, then we accept less as the hiring entity. Again, I do think now that question of, what's your salary history has been banned in many places here in the States. That's certainly helpful, but people have just shifted to now ask, well, what are your salary expectations? And so while that's a different question, if women aren't comfortable really knowing their value, understanding what their value is, and demanding that, then unfortunately that shift isn't going to bridge the gap as quickly as we would like it to.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that is a systemic problem that, employers want to pay the least amount that they can for the candidate, right? They're trying to save some budget and everything for other things. And I've also been very lucky not to have experienced anything like that. And I haven't had any unfair treatment towards me. And I was very lucky to work for companies that didn't have those practices. And in fact, I went through an interview training at Google, and there was a very, very big focus on bias training and a huge focus on not sharing information with other interviewers about the gender of the candidate or anything else, any other impressions that could skew somebody's perception of the candidate. So that was very good. However, since I am talking to a large community of women in technology, I have heard stories of unfair treatment when it comes to hiring, and also women being asked inappropriate questions during the interview process, which is a really bad practice, regardless of who you are and what role you're hiring for. It's just when you're trying to I don't know, it's either trying to undermine the candidate, or it's literally reflecting the company's values. It's just unacceptable.
Thank you both for those answers. That was fantastic. I'd like to shift to the next question here. Mesha, I'd like to begin with you. So specifically with what can employees do and professionals do, I know that you do have a lot of experience about giving negotiating tips. I'm wondering if you could perhaps summarize some of those here as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, employees, both men and women, should negotiate, right? And in order to negotiate, they should do their research and they should really prepare for it. And doing your research involves understanding your market value, right? How much candidates like you should be paid for what they're doing. And I love the research that DICE has done in order, both in terms of the gender pay gap in tech and also the salaries in tech and the statistics around that. I think that's a great starting point for that research, because it's very important to understand what is the benchmark here, right? What is the level that you should be paid for, and prepare using that data for that negotiation. Prepare your non-negotiables, right? What benefits again, do your research on the benefits as well. What benefits and what salary ranges are non-negotiable, right? You need that, you deserve that. And also, what is your market value, being able to communicate that. And finally, your oh my God, I forgot the actual terminology, but basically, what alternatives do you have, and what does the company have in terms of their alternatives if this deal doesn't happen? And the more alternatives you have, the better, because the more power it will give you in this negotiation. So yes, research, prepare, and then make sure that you are responsive and that you're respectful and that you're listened throughout the process. So yeah, that's some of my advice when it comes to negotiation. But another thing that I think that employees can do to tackle this issue is to be more transparent about their salaries. I know it's a taboo subject and we can get a little strange talking about it, right? But it is very important, and especially between male and female employees, just sharing the numbers and really understanding what's the picture. We need to get over that taboo and be more transparent, because this is the only way employees can be empowered in this situation.
As an HR professional, of course, my heart palpitates when I hear you say those words. But, it's true. There does need to be pay transparency. It has to be a conversation. And if the company is not going to be transparent about how they pay or how they make pay decisions, then employees usually will find a way to take it upon themselves to do that. And from that employee side, I so agree about the negotiating and the researching and really understanding worth and not being afraid to ask for that and really demand it and kind of hold that line. I also think that, to the point about sharing salaries, females need males to stand up for us a little bit. We need that support and that partnership from them saying, this is what we're all worth. This is the market value of the role that we have and the education that we have in this city that we're working on. And we think it's fair that everybody be paid that same rate. For the employer side, one of the things that we work with our clients all the time is to pay for the job, not pay for the education, not pay for, of course, those are factors and those might be multipliers, but really, let's look at the role without any people in the role. Let's not figure out who's in the role, men, women, whatever. Let's just say, here's your role. Let's set a salary range for that role. And then we can figure out what those multipliers look like for education or experience or location, obviously for employers who are hiring in multiple cities or states or countries. So we can figure all of that out, but let's just have really, this is what this role plays. This is what this role pays. And so when you're in an interview situation, you don't have to say, what are your salary expectations? You say, here's what we pay. This is our number. Is this fitting for you? Is this what you were thinking about? And then give them that ability then to negotiate based on whatever their needs are, whatever they think their worth is. So starting the conversation, letting the candidate tell you what their expectations, really the employer saying, this is where we are based on what we know about your experience, your education. This is the number. This is what we pay. And having it makes compensation conversations so much easier for hiring managers who get very uncomfortable having these conversations. It makes it very cut and dry for HR and finance and everyone else for budgeting. And then it just makes the process so much smoother when you have this kind of, this is what we know, because the employer has also done their research. They also know what the market value is, and they're paying at that rate. It just makes things so much cleaner. And then you don't really have companies that do that well. You see their pay disparity is either non-existent or it's extremely low, maybe from some historical pay that they are trying to fix now. So I think it's really important to pay for the role and not change your pay based on the candidate that's in front of you.
I love that approach. I think that will definitely help solve this problem. I also want to add that benefits should also be treated in the same way, and maybe companies should do research internally in terms of what candidates that work there, and especially focusing on the minorities, right, on women and different types of women, right, pregnant women, women who are not pregnant, basically do research with their employees to see how can they empower them to do their best work in this workplace, because men and women are different. We've seen it from the numbers. We want slightly different things. We focus on slightly different things in a workplace. And I know that throughout our lives, everyone has their whole spectrum of needs, whether you're a man or woman, however you identify yourself, you will have different needs. And I think that employers should be sensitive to those, and in order to empower their employees.
Thank you both. That was really great to hear, really great insight. I want to go to this last question before we open it up to our audience. And I'd like to remind everyone that they can ask questions in the question panel. So I'd just like to leave off here with my questions in terms of what changes would you like to see in both the near term and the short term? And so why don't we begin with Sabrina here?
Sure. So I would love for companies to really look at their compensation. I think that because leaders not intentionally create a pay gap and go into hiring decisions and say, I'm going to pay this person less because she's female, they assume that they don't have a problem. And they assume that there is no pay gap in their organization. And then when we sit down and we look, there is one. And it wasn't intentional, nobody meant to do it, but it happened. And so I would love really in the short term for reports like this, webinars like this, to really spur companies across the globe to do the math, sit down and look at the numbers and make sure that at least in your organization, you feel confident that you're not creating a huge pay gap. And if there is one, create a plan to fix it. What are you going to do about it, both for current employees and the future ones coming in? Obviously, in the long term, I'm hoping that more more insight, more data will continue. I don't think this is a topic that we can let go. I think it's one that we have to continue kind of pounding. We certainly get information fatigue sometimes on things like this, but it's one that regardless of fatigue, we just can't let this go. And so we have to continue to talk about it, continue to raise awareness, continue to have, International Women's Day and things like that, where we talk about these pay gaps. And, to the point about minorities, certainly, right? Because you have the pay gap for white females to male, but then the gap is even greater when you start talking about, Black and Asian and other minorities. And so it's so important that we keep talking about it, keep raising awareness, and keep encouraging companies at an individual level to look at their own pay and make sure that they really are in line as much as they think they are.
I completely agree. I love that. And yeah, I completely agree that awareness and really talking about it and tracking the numbers, visualizing them, right? Because if we just talk about the gender pay gap as this mysterious unicorn, nothing is going to get done because it's so abstract. However, if we put real numbers and if we raise awareness around them, something will start getting done. And I would love to see that happen in the next year or the next 5 years. And another thing that I would love to see is for women to empower each other to negotiate further. And just like Sabrina said, for men to empower women to do the same, because we're all in this together. We're all working towards a better tech industry, a better problem solving, and we need everybody's support and help in doing so. So yeah, learning how to negotiate and empowering each other, regardless of the gender, is going to be wonderful. So I really hope to see that come true someday soon.
Well, thank you both very much. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our audience. And I have a question here. Masha, why don't we begin with you? So this question asks, what advice do you have for women who ask for fair compensation, but are labeled as unappreciative or aggressive?
I think that if an employer is doing that, maybe that is not the right environment for you to be working in, because you want to make sure that you are being appreciated um, for what you are, for the value that you're bringing to the company, and that you're fairly compensated for that value. Again, if you've done your research, if you know your market value and you know you should be paid more, and your employer reacts this way, maybe this is not the right employer.
Yeah, that one's so hard, right? I completely agree. And I think um, you have to be where you are supported and where you are appreciated. And because this is maybe new for people, I don't know, maybe it's new for some hiring managers to have empowered females asking for what they're worth, then their reaction is to say, oh, you're just angry or unappreciative or whatever it is. But as hard as that decision may be, as hard as the transition may be, and certainly I'm not advocating that anybody just go and up and quit their job, but it may be time to look for something different, because you absolutely deserve to be in a place where you are appreciated, and that when you know you are asking for something that is fair, when you're not making crazy demands, but you're just simply asking to be treated equal, if the employer doesn't want to hear that and doesn't want to appreciate that and support that, then and you wonder in the long run how they're going to do. Are they going to be an employer for very long anyway, if that's the way they're going to continue to be? So I know it's such a hard situation to be in, but I completely agree that it could be time then to start a job search and find that place that is going to appreciate and support what you're worth.
Thank you both, and thank you to our audience. We're getting a lot of really great questions here, really important questions. And this next one says, is it enough for me as an individual contributor to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace to normalize the topic? Or should I be pushing my agenda with fierceness? So why don't we begin with Masha here?
So to make sure that I understood the question, is it enough to be pushing this agenda and spreading awareness around this topic as an individual, or should it be on a more mass level? Is that correct?
Yes, that is my interpretation of the question as well.
Okay, so I think that however you're comfortable speaking up, do that, right? Your voice should be heard. And whatever level, whatever medium you select, if you feel like that your voice is being heard, do that, right? As an individual contributor, you can do so much, and also on a mass scale, you can do so much. But both of those forms of communication have their pluses and minuses, and it's just really up to you on your capabilities and your bandwidth as well, because when you're spreading the word to the masses, it might take more bandwidth and more energy and more effort. I mean, it really depends on how you're doing this, right? But whatever you feel you can do and whatever impact you want to have, do that. I feel like it starts with you. There's no right or wrong answer here.
Yeah, I agree. And I can tell you that in my experience in HR, both in 125,000 employee organizations down to 10-person startups, that a lot of major changes that are made inside organizations start with individual contributors. So I would say that if you're in an organization and diversity and inclusion and pay parity are important issues to you and are important topics, then speak up and continue to speak up until you find that person that's going to hear you. I always encourage employees to find their champion. Find there's more than likely some other leader, some other individual in the company that agrees with you, and maybe they haven't felt comfortable bringing it up, or maybe they feel like nothing can be done, and so they're just staying silent. And so really talking to other employees, talking to leaders, and that's how movements start, right? You start with usually one person, and then another person joins, and before you know it, you have quite a big group in the organization that's speaking out against the same thing. And that's when you can start to really affect change. So I think that absolutely, you have to find balance, because if you are the only person talking about it, you certainly don't want to, I guess, beat the dead horse so much that it shuts people down and they're no longer listening. So you do have to figure out what that balance is, but I wouldn't let it go. I would find ways to talk to different people, talk to leaders, and eventually you'll probably land on, a couple other people who agree and just maybe haven't, had the guts to say anything. And once you have that, you start to get that power in numbers, then that's when you really, really can make a difference.
Thank you. So I have another question here. What are some tools and platforms you recommend for assessing your market value? Why don't we begin with Sabrina for this one?
Sure. So the wonderful world of the internet, right, has so much information out there. There's tons of sites like Glassdoor, salary.com, PayScale, a lot of those obviously reports like this that DICE and others have put out. And so you do have to be aware of how the information is being gathered. There's not going to be one place that you can go to and get exact numbers and certainly get exact numbers on what an employer is paying, or what their worth is. There's no real calculator, unfortunately, that probably accurately predicts what your worth is. But just a simple Google search, a lot of times when I'm doing comp studies for employers, so on the other end, trying to figure out their compensation strategy, I will go to places like PayScale, salary.com, even LinkedIn has a salary component if you pay for their service. And you can get some pretty good data around offers, what those offers have looked like based on experience, on location. Sometimes it's more general. Sometimes it can be very, very specific depending on what you're looking at. And just do that research, read the reports that are out there, especially in tech. There is so much data that's out there and that's available. Understanding the cost of living in the city that you're in, which is easily available through your government pages, understanding how that compares. If you're in a city like San Francisco, for example, that cost of living is significantly higher than it would be in maybe in Austin, Texas. So I think sometimes just simple, starting with a Google search, reading what reports are available, and then some very specific sites like a PayScale, Glassdoor, LinkedIn can give you some insights into what jobs are posted for around your experience. And then like a site like a Glassdoor, and I'm sure some of the tech sites might know of others, but they will actually have employees that have gone on and at least their rate. So you get a general idea of what that looks like.
Yeah, I completely agree. You're not going to find a perfect number. Unfortunately, it's all about common sense and understanding where you are in your career, and kind of putting things together from all of the websites that Sabrina has mentioned. It takes research. You're not gonna just find a solution that fits your situation. You have to do some thinking and everything, but it's possible. And yeah, a lot of people do it this way.
Yeah, and I think if you have male counterparts that are in the roles and they're willing to share, why not ask the question? I know, I think about asking my friends what they make. They're probably not too open to share, but sometimes I will approach it when I'm trying to do comp studies. I'll approach it from here's the range that I think this fits in, maybe not directly, what are you making? Can you, tell me what you're making, but just kind of here's the range that I'm thinking. Is that consistent with your experience? And just a simple yes or no there can really help you tell you if you're in the right ballpark or if you're way off.
Thank you both. And I'd also like to mention that DICE has a salary calculator as well that you can certainly use to gauge salaries for specific positions and locations as well. We have another question here, which is, why don't we go with Sabrina on this one? Would it promote equality for a company to set a salary for the role and do away with negotiation altogether?
Say the first part again, I apologize.
Sure thing. It is, would it promote equality for a company to set a salary for a specific role and do away with the negotiation altogether?
Yes, I think it would. I think you do have to, depending on the role, sometimes it's hard to just say one number. I found it very difficult as I'm creating comp structures to just say, okay, and I'm just making stuff up here, but software engineer pays 80,000, period, because you do have to take in varying levels of experience, maybe, certain software they've worked on, that may be weighted differently. So what I find is that we usually like to have a range, and we do keep the range fairly small. It's not a $50,000 range, it's a pretty small range, just so that there is a little bit of negotiation room for the candidate, especially when they've got a little bit more experience than other candidates, or they've worked on something very, very specific that you're looking for that other candidates may not have. But certainly like at a junior level. So if you're hiring junior software engineers, maybe just a year or two out of college, it's a very easy one to set a direct salary for. This is what we start, this is what we pay, this is how we move up through the compensation structure as you get more experience and stay with us. And I think, where we are with tech hiring these days, they want to see that engineers would rather have a structure that they know, this is where I am today, this is where I'll be in 6 months or a year or whatever it is, and kind of have that progress up. And so I think absolutely it promotes equality. Absolutely, it takes the pressure off of hiring managers or anybody else to have to figure out what salary should be, because you have very clear guidelines. This is what you pay. You have a multiplier or a qualifier if they do have some kind of extra experience, or they have some directly that you're looking for, but that's not much, right? It's not a qualifier or multiplier. It's just something that keeps you within that range. So that even if you have varying salaries on a team, that they're within just a few $1,000s of each other, and that you can absolutely justify why one person might be getting just a few thousand more than the last person.
I love that. I completely agree. And I think that it should be down to the person's experience and how much value they can bring to the company when it comes to, ticking off those boxes that will give you maybe something else within the range, but it shouldn't be based on gender, of course. And I love this approach to hiring and setting salaries. I'm learning a lot today myself, so yeah, I'll shut up now.
Thank you both. So we're getting closer to the end of time here, but I do see a couple more. So this next one, I'd like to direct to you first, Masha. It is, how do you politely decline about the previous salary question if an employer is adamant on getting those details?
Oof, that's a good question. To be honest, I have never done it myself. But what I would recommend is, and I would love to hear Sabrina's take on this as well. What I would recommend is to point out that this is not necessarily the best and the fairest hiring practice, and or just straight away direct into a question: what do professionals like? The job that you're trying to hire me for, what do they make? So kind of redirect the question, answer a question with a question, and redirect it towards the employer. Sabrina, what are your thoughts on this? Because I haven't had any experience with this, so I don't want to give a question, an answer that is not exactly as per practices.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. So saying to them, I'm sure that we can come up with the right and fair amount for my position, my education, my experience. What range are people like me in your company making? And so turning it back on the employer here in the States, and I'm sure we probably have people online that may not be in the United States, but in the United States, there are many states that have laws against asking around salary history. They can ask salary expectations. And I'm in California, for example, which is a very tough state to hire in. But if a candidate asks a recruiter or a hiring manager what their range is, the hiring manager has to tell them. The recruiter has to tell them. They have to have a number. So it's very fair if they ask you for salary expectations or salary history in places where that's still legal, for you to turn it right around and say, I'm confident that we will be able to come to an agreement on this, but why don't you tell me what your range for this role is, and then I will tell you if that fits what I'm looking for. So I think that's the easiest way to do it. And I would tell you, this is just my experience, and if they're hesitant to do that, if they're really unwilling to do that, then that could be a red flag that their pay is not maybe where you want to be. So I think it's absolutely fair to go turn it right back around and ask for their range, and hold to it. Don't feel like, even if they keep pressuring you, because obviously recruiters, they're good at this. We've been doing it a long time. And so, they may keep asking, they keep pushing. But again, if you just keep going back to, I'm happy to tell you if my number fits in your range, if you'll just tell me what your range is. And so just keep pushing it, gently but appropriately that way. So eventually, hopefully they'll share. And if they don't, then that will be a red flag in the interviewing process.
I love that law in California, and I guess this all comes back to doing your research, right, before entering the negotiation and entering the conversation about your salary, and doing research on the regulations in your state or in your country. What are your rights when it comes to that process? So yeah, make sure you research that.
Thank you both. And I have our last question here. Sabrina, I'd like to begin with you here. And so this is, what can recruiters specifically do to combat the gender pay gap?
Great question. So as recruiters, we get stuck in the middle quite a bit, right? So we have companies and hiring managers who have very specific expectations, and they have very specific budgets. And then you have candidates who have the same. They have expectations, have numbers that they need and that they expect, and usually fairly expect to make once they are employed. And recruiters often get stuck in that middle place. And so I think on the front end, before we ever go to market with it, before we ever open up a job and try to start hiring for it, we have to have honest conversations with the hiring managers around expectations. We have to know, as recruiters, what is the market value of this role, and is the company high, low, mid-market? We have to be very ourselves around what are we up against in the hiring process. If we know at engineering our area 80 and we're only going to make 70, you're only willing to pay 70, then the hiring process is going to be difficult, right? And we're only going to get maybe junior candidates. And so we have to set those expectations with hiring managers before we ever take the route to market. And then getting them to really nail down what that number looks like. So a lot of times when we start hiring, and a hiring manager will say to us, well, just give me candidates and then we'll figure out the salary. And I don't ever want to do that, because first of all, it could waste a lot of time if they know a certain number in their head, they just don't want to share yet because they want to see what they can get. And so really getting them to give you a number that they're willing to pay, and then approaching again in the interview process the comp conversations from that aspect, I think is going to be super important. Outside of comp, there's tons of companies that have gone to what they call blind resumes. So recruiters actually pass resumes to hiring managers that have no names on them. They have nothing that would identify gender or ethnicity. They've really kind of taken that information off, just because there are unconscious biases. Again, I've said several times that I'm doing this intentional, but sometimes we have those unconscious biases we don't even know about, and we see a certain name on a resume and kind of disqualify them a little bit. So I think that that's necessary all the time or in every company, but I certainly know companies have gone that route where they have removed those identifying markers. So I think those are some things recruiters can certainly consider and implement if it makes sense for their business.
Yeah, and to add about the bias thing, well, companies, at least in my experience, companies that are recruiting internally, a lot of the times they have bias training and a specific training for the interviewing process, because bias can come into play during that process. So I think that's another thing that employers and recruiters can do, like specific bias training for the interview process and the recruitment process, so that the ethnicity and the gender or any other identifying factors will not cloud the judgment of whoever is dealing with the candidate at whichever stage they're going through. And those work normally by just recognizing those biases, right? Recognizing that, okay, I know that I sometimes tend to be biased towards this people with these identifying markers, and recognizing those biases in yourself and really understanding that they're coming into play here and they shouldn't. So yeah, bias training is another thing that I think they can do.
Well, thank you both very much for taking the time to answer all these questions. When DICE first put out this report, we really went out with the goal to publish this data that we thought was very important. And then the second part of that was to then foster conversation based off of what we found. So we really appreciate you both helping us achieve that goal and to have this conversation. So thank you very much for your time. I know that there's a lot of questions that we didn't get to today, which we will be following up with via email. So we certainly will get to those. So I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us. And Masha and Sabrina, if you have anything else to sign off on, that'd be great.
Yeah, so first, I appreciate DICE for putting this together, obviously, and making it public and having these conversations. So a lot of times what happens is somebody will publish a report, but then we don't get to have this conversation. We don't get to have this follow-up. I absolutely love that you had me and Masha together, to people from two different sides of this coin. I think that brings hopefully a helpful, balanced perspective to anybody listening. So I know that this is, it's a tough topic, and it's one that can polarize people at times who maybe don't think it exists or don't think it's a problem. And so I really appreciate being a part of this and being able to give my thoughts and hopefully give some ideas on how we can lessen the gap.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree with what Sabrina has said. It is wonderful when there isn't just a report, but there is action being taken behind it. And I think that this report should not be seen as a depressing message about the state of of technology, the technology industry. I think that this should be perceived as a call to action, a call to make the tech industry equal. And I am very excited to see where we'll be in a year's time.
Well, on behalf of DICE and everybody here, thank you very much for your time. So with just a few minutes left before time, I'm going to sign off here. So thank you, everybody.